Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I think we're about ready to start this afternoon's programme. Welcome back to everybody. Hope you enjoyed your break for lunch. We're now going to move ahead and look at session 3. This is post-2015 implementation, suggestions and challenges. So in the morning we looked at where we're at in the conversation for the post-2015 agenda so far. We looked at specific country examples of implementation of the MDGs. Now we're looking forward to think about, well, what are the challenges and implications of what we know so far for the post-2015 agenda. And for those of you, I think there are some who are just joining us now, all the information, all the materials for all the speakers will be available on the website for this event, which is at undp.org/USPC. There's the address on the screen. So I'm going to hand this session over to a colleague of mine, but what I'm going to do first of all is ask for all the speakers in this session to please come up to the stage now. And as they do that, I'll give you a little quick run through of who they are. So we're going to be joined by Dr. Richard Manning, who's the chair of the Institute of Development Studies and also the chair of International Initiative for Impact Evaluation. Also with us will be John Hyde, who is the chair of Global Organization of Parliamentarians Against Corruption in Oceania. We have John Gershman, who's a clinical associate professor of public service and the deputy director of New York University's MPH program. Gordon Manwain is from the Office of the Special Envoy on MDGs for the President of the Republic of Indonesia. Mr. Chen Xiaochun is a counselor at the Embassy of the People's Republic of China, right here in the Republic of Korea. And Mr. Ad Melkert is a former UNDP Associate Administrator and a former Special Representative of the Secretary General in Iraq. I'm going to hand this session over to my colleague, Mr. Shantanu Mukherjee, Dr. Shantanu Mukherjee, who is the UNDP's head on, lead on MDG policy and framework, and he's going to take you through this session. Dr. Mukherjee, if you'd like to take over, Dr. Mukherjee. Thank you.
Thanks, Richard, and sorry. Thanks, Rajesh. I went ahead and introduced our next speaker while trying to thank the previous one. I think we're very well set up for this session. We've looked at global considerations. We've looked at some examples of country-level action, and I think in this session we'll be looking at some of the broader, more general themes around implementation, which the country-level illustrations serve to highlight, issues such as building capacity and institutions, new forms of accountability, partnerships, and what are the building blocks for renewing this, and resources for development. So it's a great pleasure to hand over to Richard Manning, who is intimately connected with the MDGs, having been chairman of OECD DAC during the formative years. Over to you, Richard.
Thank you very much, Shantanu. So I'm going to talk to you, first of all, about the institutional aspects of this, but let me just say a word about this real significance of what we're discussing here today. I think it's fair to say that implementation has been a missing dimension in past attempts to move the world forward with a framework. And I think that the Korean government and UNDP deserve a lot of praise for putting this item squarely on the agenda now already in 2013. I look back at some of the earlier big meetings and I picked up this depressing quote from the Beijing Women's Conference in 1994 that really nothing they'd recommended 10 years earlier had been achieved. When the OECD started looking at international goals in the mid-1990s, they correctly said that these have to be pursued country by country through individual approaches, but they gave little guidance as to how that was to be done. I did a study myself in 2009 to look at what the impact of the MDG framework had been, and my conclusion was, as you see on screen, that while there was a lot of rhetorical support for selected aspects of the framework, it was hard to find good examples of translation of this into actual resource allocation. I hope that things, and I think there's some evidence to suggest things have moved on since 2009, but I think there's still a lot to do. And just last month, the Institute of Development Studies, I'm chair of the board there, produced a very useful document in which we had a lot of southern voices about the MDGs and the future. And the conclusion we came to from that was that the MDG framework has had some real-world traction in some circumstances, but little in others. So we shouldn't be over-optimistic about how automatic implementation is going to be. And if it's going to work, institutions have to function. Public policies will be central to success. Public service delivery will often be important. And so the effectiveness of public institutions at local level as well as national level will be crucial. But we all know that institutions in all our governments are far from perfect. And we also know, at least I would certainly assert, that we've not done a very good job in institution building internationally, and donor support has often been ineffective. So how can we do better in the future? And it's not even just a southern issue. As pointed out to me by John Gershman, it's an issue also for institutions in every country. If you look at how, for example, all our institutions chase companies who are squirreling away profits abroad, all the competence of all our institutions is being stretched. I think a way of looking at this that the OECD suggested is to look at building institutions at 3 levels. At the lowest level, the staff level, clearly you want competent people working for you, so the quality of the education system and the way in which you deliver training is very important. But staff can't be effective if the institution itself is not set up to be effective. And so the organizational dynamics within institutions are a crucial part of why one institution is competent and another one is ineffective. And I think that's why a lot of the traditional approaches of technical assistance, where you send somebody to train a counterpart, just don't work, because the institution within which that is taking place is not set up to deliver effective results. But that itself also turns on the operating environment within which institutions work. And so here you come to difficult issues of why the national operating environment for institutions can be very weak in many countries. So even if you have an institution trying to behave competently, it may be that it's almost impossible to do so in the circumstances of the country. And that requires one, I think, to look at very carefully at the incentives at each of these levels. At the top level, I do think that, first of all, you need strong commitment from the top of government to holding institutions to account and making them more accountable. I don't think you're ever going to see competent public institutions unless they're scrutinized effectively by parliaments, by auditors, independent evaluation. I'm chair of an international initiative for impact evaluation. I think independent evaluation is crucial. But you also need an environment where transparency is recognized as important, where whistleblowing is facilitated rather than stamped on. And John Hyde will be talking in a minute about the anti-corruption agenda. At the next level down, the way in which you set objectives, delegate to staff and hold people to account and monitor and evaluate performance is crucial. And that's hopefully where whatever targets countries accept under a new framework will be put into real action. And at the staff level, you want real ownership of these objectives across the whole organization with the right kind of skills and the right way of reviewing people's performance. Let me give you an example of how complex some of these issues are. This is a study that's just going on at the moment between a set of institutions about how to reduce teacher absenteeism in primary schools in Uganda. It's not that Uganda is unique in this. A very large number of countries have problems in ensuring that teachers turn up reliably. So they tested 4 schemes that teacher attendance will be monitored either by head teachers or by the parents, and either with a reporting of this by SMS to everybody, or by also giving a financial bonus. So there were 4 alternative schemes were tried. And what did they find? They found that the only one that worked is when the head teachers did the monitoring and the teachers got a financial reward. Both those conditions had to be met for this to have any effect at all. And that all monitors understate teacher absenteeism. Parents do so even more than head teachers, which is quite interesting. So what conclusions does one draw from this? Local monitoring schemes can improve teacher presence, but the quality of reporting is a challenge. And interestingly, they suggest that the way forward might be for head teachers to do the monitoring, but for parents to audit the head teachers rather than for parents to do the monitoring. I think that's quite an interesting and intelligent idea. But what it does show is that it's very easy for me to stand here and say institutions should be held to account. But how you do this is a really subtle and complicated set of issues. These local accountability systems are important, and there are competing incentives. People have to, on the one hand, they should be concerned that teachers aren't in school. On the other hand, the teachers they have to work with, there may be reasons why teachers have to be away. They have to understand the circumstances, and it takes time and effort to do this. So we're just beginning to learn how technological advances should be matched with the human challenges facing teachers, managers, and parents. And that's just one simple example of how complicated these issues become in practice. Much scope, therefore, for experimenting with new ways of incentivizing good institutional performance. And finally, I think people do not recognize adequately the importance of the economic dimension to institutional performance. And the way I put it is that I don't think countries can build sustainable institutions unless they are competitive employers of their own talent, while still keeping the public pay bill within whatever bounds taxation and other resources set. And this looks a nice statement as I put it like that, but the consequences of this are quite difficult. It very likely implies that in many countries there should be greater dispersion of salaries. People have to pay more market-related salaries to attract and retain talent in certain areas. I think a lot of countries have been too ready to leverage up salaries generally and to leave the government unable to attract talent to the areas that are in short supply. And it may also, keep the public pay bill down, mean that a tougher attitude has to be taken to the numbers that the public sector can employ. So this is not a road to popularity. But I think if we're going to build sustainable institutions in the future, we have to look very carefully also at the economic dimension. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Richard. Indeed, some of these considerations are vital when we talk about improving quality, which is one of the central challenges facing us. Next from our panel is John Hyde. He's chair of the Global Organization of Parliamentarians Against Corruption and keenly involved in setting up this institutional mechanism in different parts of Asia and the Pacific. John, over to you.
Okay, so I push that first. Yep. Thanks very much. Look, I'm delighted to be here, and I do thank our hosts and UNDP and the South Korean government. Corruption is a huge issue. The World Bank estimates that more than $1 trillion is paid in bribes every year, the largest of which are to obtain state contracts and monopolies. The UN Office on Drugs and Crime estimates that multinational criminality moves $2.3 million per year across borders, enabled by the active collusion or passive inattention of regulators. The Tax Justice Network estimates that governments lose $3.1 trillion per year because of tax evasion, disproportionately by those with the resources to sway policy makers or public servants. Now, by comparison, meeting our much vaunted Millennium Development Goals would cost no more than $481 billion in development. What the world loses to corruption in a single year would be enough to end the worst forms of human misery and transform human civilization at least a dozen times over. This issue is enormous and does need to be addressed. The UN is realising the extent to which corruption negatively impacts development goals, as can be seen by the proposed Goal 10E of the high-level panel report on the post-2015 development agenda, to reduce bribery and corruption and ensure officials can be held accountable. Parliamentarians are responsible for legislation in their countries. They influence domestic agendas directly through anti-corruption legislation and through ensuring that their budgets reflect real priorities. Now, parliamentarians are central to controlling corruption, as executives are unlikely to hold themselves to account. A parliamentarian sits at the apex of the systems of accountability. In fact, parliaments are often the single most important domestic accountability institution. GOPAC's mission is to provide peer-to-peer capacity building support and assist parliamentarians in their advocacy and the development of legislation to ensure governments are accountable and transparent. GOPAC works as a decentralised organisation, and many of our national chapters do have track records of success in the anti-corruption fight. I've listed here a few examples from places as diverse and often in the media for the wrong reasons, such as the Philippines, Zambia, Timor-Leste, probably the poorest country in the world, still has the ability and the time to realise that if they don't tackle or work towards prevention of corruption, they're going to be losing more money and more development potential. Now, a number of speakers today have mentioned the issue of resources. All of us are wanting to find resources to fund the very important activities that the MDGs can deliver. A number of other very diverse speakers have stated the importance of accountability, transparency, and recognise the role of parliamentarians. So if we seriously do want to have a discussion about increasing resources so as we can cut maternal morbidity, raise the living experiences of all human beings, then we've got to have the discussion about cutting corruption so as those resources are available. Now, working with legislators, we've made many important strides, but this work is not without challenges. Despite the important role that parliamentarians play, there are few programs that focus on developing their capacity in this area. We work with sitting parliamentarians. I was a Member of Parliament in Australia for 12 years, and MPs are juggling a variety of issues. But once they commit to anti-corruption issues, we need to harness that commitment and mobilise resources quickly to ensure that their enthusiasm has an impact. Now, with the current aid delivery architecture, it takes an immense amount of time to even get small but impactful projects off the ground. Sustainable support in this area, as with so many others, will ensure that momentum continues despite the competing priorities that parliamentarians face. Now, every country has a different history, a different legal system, and a sociological and cultural context. Countries cannot be easily compared against each other. Indicators in place to measure corruption, including bribery, are based on perception. The perception of what is corrupt, legal definition, societal acceptance varies from one country to another. This does make it challenging to consider a universally comparable indicator of corruption. Now, GOPAC is developing an aggregate index that combines indicators based on perception with anti-corruption framework, laws and regulations, and practical implementation of anti-corruption practices. And this, we believe, will provide a more robust means for countries to evaluate their success in the fight against corruption, and also to enable our partners in civil society to ensure that their parliamentarians, their representatives, are acting in a transparent way. Now, the indicators GOPAC proposes to use can be further broken down into different categories so that the advancement of countries can be compared to other countries facing similar circumstances in the anti-corruption fight. Now, as we are in the development stage of this tool, we'd certainly welcome the feedback of people in this room and others who are interested in anti-corruption and in getting a fairer, more transparent, more accountable development agenda underway, so as that we can end up with an efficient and an impactful monitoring framework for anti-corruption. Parliamentarians are not elitists. The modern parliamentarian sees herself or himself very much as being part of civil society and being different to the government. It's really important that we do empower and engage with parliamentarians so as all of us can join together in the fight against corruption. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. Indeed, parliamentarians are among the greatest constitutional sources of accountability and oversight. And I guess as we move forward and make the MDG agenda ever more local, there will be questions of how to translate this into federal and other subnational levels. I thought Richard had done a fantastic job of communicating some complex ideas within the 10-minute time slot, and he did so well that we're about to invite him to do so once again.
As you can see, I'm stretching my expertise extremely thinly today. We're talking here about new forms of accountability, and I'd like just to talk a little bit about the importance of civil society in this connection. And while it's obvious that the public plans for implementation matter a great deal, we've got to have nationally owned strategies which have got to be supported by internationally consistent data collection and monitoring and by regular reviews at national, regional, and international levels. We know that public sector approaches are never going to be sufficient in their own right. Governments are always tempted to default to politically convenient short-term decisions. In any case, government simply cannot deliver on issues that involve behavior change at community or individual level. It has to be approached in a much more subtle way. And governments are not actually as good as all that in delivering services, and they certainly shouldn't be seen as monopoly providers of services, except in some key areas. So the role of civil society, and indeed the private sector, which we've not talked about much so far, are essential. And civil society in particular has huge roles in delivery of services, which I'm not going to talk about, but also in holding governments to account, which I will talk about. And here I'd like to say that civil society should always, in my opinion, be interpreted broadly. It's not just the non-governmental organizations, which are often thought of in this space, but religious institutions, trade unions. I think we underestimate the importance to the development of all our countries of professional associations and standard-setting bodies, the bodies that where civil engineers get together and hold each other to account to improve standards, that kind of thing. The media are crucially important. We've got the BBC here today, but I mean, all media play a huge role in all this. Foundations, think tanks need to be developed in many countries as well. So let's define civil society broadly. And of course, we have to have international objectives that deliver the basis for campaigning and facilitate comparison, but we avoid a situation where they are not locally owned or inappropriate. And of course, internationally, you can't take account of the subnational dimension adequately, and that's very important. So to my mind, objectives always have to be used intelligently. They're good servants, but they're bad masters. So I'm going to go quickly through 5 ways in which civil society can, in my view, best encourage progress. First of all, civil society has to be strongly independent of government, and I think I'm pretty impressed in the conversations so far about post-2015 by the way in which civil society has organized itself to make its contribution. And some of the key players in this are here today, which I very much welcome. But it's going to be very important in particular to bring the development and environment communities together more effectively. And at national level, I'd like to congratulate UNDP on the work it has done in raising the profile of this and facilitating what has been done, but initiatives always have to be locally owned. And civil society needs to maintain its independence and ability to challenge on the one hand, but to understand government and communicate effectively with government. And that means that everybody has to work together to achieve good results. Data are crucial here. We've heard about the so-called data revolution that we need. There is some progress. ECOSOC's reported that the percentage of countries for which most of the MDGs present at least 2 points in time has increased from 2 to 83% in a decade. That's not nothing. There's a long way to go, but we have made progress. But we do need this data revolution because we are desperately short, particularly of disaggregated data, which we're going increasingly to need. And data is no good on its own. It needs to be analyzed and disseminated. And this is a great role for think tanks and the media, as well as for campaigning NGOs. Similarly, monitoring public service delivery. There's a big debate going on in academic circles about what are the real lessons one can take on this. There's a very interesting report by Svensson and colleagues on improvements in school performance in Uganda when it became clear how much money had been allocated to each school, because that gave everybody incentive to say how it's being used. But as the study I've just shown you shows, there's also questions about whether people actually turn up at schools as well. So getting that right is not straightforward, but undoubtedly it's a very important area where civil society organizations of all sorts can and should put some focus. Also, to challenge poor and inappropriate policies, and I think this is where think tanks in particular could play a bigger role, and civil society organizations and the media can work effectively together, but it does require good underlying analysis based on real experience, and it does need, and this is a crucial issue, an enabling environment where civil society can actually make its voice heard, and this means that we need governments that are prepared to encourage pluralism and openness in a situation where too often public institutions can be capricious and unaccountable. We all know that governments in all our countries, every single country in the world, can be far too sensitive to criticism. And I note that Civicus, a civil society organization which carries a lot of weight, has asserted that the conditions in which civil society operates are shaky at best and even deteriorating in many parts of the world. And that's a serious challenge to us all, I think, to ensure that governments recognize the significance of this. Governments, therefore, need to be readier to allow uncomfortable criticism. And this is a message that needs to be got over. You'll get better results if you allow yourself to be criticized than if you're saying that you're perfect all the time. However, there's a second side to this, which is that civil society organizations must ensure their own standards and legitimacy. They can't be taken seriously if their own house is not in order. And for civil society, unlike parliamentarians of whom we're talking, their legitimacy is not built in. It needs to be earned. So it's important to note that there has been significant progress in this direction in the last few years, and I really welcome this. For example, in 2010, civil society organizations agreed some very important principles in Istanbul. Among these, the international NGOs set up an accountability panel. I'm actually a member of this at the moment, which looks at the reports on accountability that the INGOs submit and critiques them. At Busan here in Korea in 2011, the international CSOs declared that alignment of their own accountability was a key factor for improving aid effectiveness, and this has led to a new CSO partnership for development effectiveness. So that's one important consequence of the Busan dialogue, that the civil society organizations themselves have realized they've got to do this. In the humanitarian space, there's a new initiative to set up a single standard, and there's a proposed global standard for core CSO accountability being developed by half a dozen organizations across the world, and I think these initiatives are very much to be supported. So thank you very much. I think these are ways in which civil society can play a really important part in moving forward to implementation.
Thanks, Richard. Of course, independence and credibility go hand in hand with civil society. Next on our speakers list is John Gershman, and he will be speaking about aid more broadly, but he also has specific expertise in a range of things, including public health programs and institutions.
Great, thank you. I'd also like to thank the hosts today and UNDP, and in particular the logistical team who's put together an incredibly smoothly moving conference and just managed everyone, I think, incredibly well. So it's always a bit of a drag to come after people like Richard and John, because you feel like you don't really have that much more to add, and can we just jump into the conversation? So I'll try to add a couple of things, and then hopefully we'll have some time at the end to really, with my other co-panelists here, to explore some of these issues. I'd like to start with a couple of things, which is that I feel one of the weaknesses of the MDG framework was that really the MDG debate started, and particularly the concept of the development partnership really ended up revolving around the question of aid in particular. And kind of the debate about development became a debate about aid. And I think one of the really incredibly valuable outcomes of the Busan meeting was to say we need to move beyond aid effectiveness, and we can't reduce the development effectiveness debate and the development accountability debate to something about aid. So I think that's absolutely essential. And that accountability and effectiveness matter much more for both private sector, public sector, and nonprofit institutions more broadly than they do for aid organizations in particular. Aid is not going to solve the problem of poverty, inequality, marginalization in the world. It's going to be at best a minor, in some cases potentially a catalytic player, but that is not going to be the critical issue. And the more we focus primarily on aid, I will argue, the more we work ourselves primarily into a dead end, a political dead end. Secondly, that there are some often contradictions between effectiveness and accountability, and I'm happy to go into those a little bit later. But finally, I want to start with a couple of definitions. So if effectiveness is our ability to achieve some desired outcomes or goals or objectives. So what is accountability? And accountability, I would argue, has two real dimensions, some of which often gets conflated. The first is answerability. That is, people responsible for something have to give an account. They have to answer for what they've done. And the second dimension is sanctions, enforcement, some mechanism of holding people, punishing people, if they fail to meet their particular standards of behavior or their particular goals and objectives. And when we sometimes talk about, well, we need to have mutual accountability from the local all the way to the global level, I think we sometimes ignore the fact that while we do have mechanisms, often, not always, have mechanisms of enforcement at the local and in some cases the national level, we have very few mechanisms, in fact zero, other than public shaming, of enforcement at the kind of regional and global levels. And that we're really talking about a different dynamic of accountability. And while we can all wish that the world was a different place in that way, that's fundamentally an existential political reality. And I think this is important because what it really means and highlights the centrality is that accountability is a political issue. It's not a technical issue, as much as we can argue about the virtue of metrics or the utility of a particular evaluation methodology like randomized controlled trials. We're really talking about power. That accountability is fundamentally about power, and if power is the currency of politics, then we're really talking about politics when we come down to it in terms of both effectiveness and accountability, and there's no real way to kind of escape that. So if we were going to think about aid in particular, this is a drawing from a book that I worked on 150 years ago, looking at accountability in the World Bank. And I think one of the issues is that we're very often speaking we speak about kind of relationship between, recipient countries and donor countries and the World Bank or other bilateral aid agencies and civil society as if these things actually meant something. And in fact, the crucial alliances for both effectiveness and accountability, I would argue, are the coalitions for effectiveness and accountability that actually transcend those institutional arenas. So when we're trying to think about how to forge mechanisms of accountability, we have to look at those elements within and across those organizations actually aligning with each other, rather than thinking that the government of Indonesia, or the government of the United States for that matter, actually agree on anything in particular substantively, that very often the ministries within those countries have sharp disagreements, and they share much more in common with their counterparts in aid agencies than they do with each other. And that is the inherent political nature of certainly the aid process as well as accountability. So if we're going to think about building mechanisms for effectiveness and accountability in the context of aid, which I'm already saying is only going to be a small part of the post-2015 story, but I think there are lessons there for the broader development effectiveness agenda. What would they be? So the first rule I would say is always follow the money. Why do we follow the money? Well, as Austrian sociologist Rudolf Goldenscheid once wrote, budgets are the skeletons of the state stripped of all misleading ideologies. So if we want to know actually what states are doing, we need to understand where the money comes from, where it goes, who's responsible for it. And so the incredible amount of wonderful work that's being done on budget transparency is going to be fundamentally central to building any kind of ongoing accountability process. Now, in that, transparency is an absolute necessary, but certainly not a sufficient condition for being able to do that. And all of the recent movements, both of nationally based rights to information movements, as well as international initiatives like the Aid Transparency Initiative, Publish What You Fund, et cetera, are all going to be essential. But good data is only the first step. You actually need political mobilization, and that data needs to be in an actionable form so that citizens can actually use it to place demands on the private actors, the public actors who are affecting their lives. This requires capacity that Richard has already talked about, and that I think one of the things that we need to think about in capacity when we talk about things like journalists and think tanks is that we're talking about building relationships that are going to be conflictual, and that sometimes we tend to only talk about consensus building and unity and shared visions. But if we're going to really talk about accountability relationships, we have to talk about conflict. And we have to talk about the ways in which we can construct conflict to actually lead accountability as a positive outcome of that conflict. And that we should downplay, I would argue, the overly consensus-focused nature of some of the conversations about visions and shared goals and so forth. Secondly, we need to think about building a capacity for accountability that is not about best practices, but is about best fit, and really developing solutions that are context-specific about solving particular problems. And that has to be a dramatic shift away from both, as Richard talked about, the traditional technical assistance model of aid organizations, but also the broader public management efforts of advocating for the application of best practice or even good practice models. Instead, we need to give people the space to experiment, to make mistakes, to fail, to learn from that. And that kind of problem-driven, iterative capacity is absolutely essential to a mechanism and process of governance that's going to be legitimate, effective, and accountable. And that, unfortunately, many of the transparency initiatives in aid and some of the discourse in the post-Paris, Accra, Busan framework are driven really by narrow concerns of financial accountability, driven by northern taxpayers and, in some cases, legislators and bureaucrats, as opposed to the people who are being acted upon by those aid programs. And I think that's a fundamental challenge. The second area is getting more bang for the buck, that aid organizations need to think about basically some of their work as providing public goods. And funding organizations, including the Open Government Partnership, Centers for Investigative Journalism, the kinds of things which are going to have multiple beneficial effects beyond simply aid programs in terms of promoting accountable and effective governance. Excuse me. And secondly, that aid organizations have to think about building relationships with organizations, not just on a narrow definition of results. Ross Iben and others in the UK have done some excellent work on this in terms of how aid organizations really need to think about the nature of the organizations they're supporting and not a narrow focus on results. The Making All Voices Count initiative, I think, is building on the effort that Ms. Grinspan talked about this morning in terms of trying to carry through and bring really multiple voices and participation to the implementation stage and not just to the agenda-setting stage of the post-2015 framework. Finally, aid organizations in their own operations need to actually walk the talk, sign on to the appropriate initiatives like the Aid Transparency Initiative, support the open data movement that Richard talked about. But we also have to acknowledge that aid organizations are creators of politics. And aid organizations need to use a political economy analysis much more systematically than they have been up to now in terms of deciding what kinds of programs to support and where. And they need to actually, as April spoke about this morning, to think about directly supporting civil society organizations that can do the kind of active monitoring and evaluation that's necessary to make these kinds of programs effective and realistic. A couple of challenges that I think have been highlighted at various points across the day that I just want to pull together that's going to be a challenge for aid, but also in a broader development effectiveness agenda. That we can talk about the importance of quality over simply access in terms of social services. Fundamentally agree, and also want to argue that the challenges for making citizens not only capable of determining whether the teacher is in school when they want to send their child to school, but evaluating how good the quality of education is there, that's a much bigger reach. That requires more resources and more sophisticated understanding so that citizens can actually distinguish high quality in terms of education and healthcare. Secondly, that monitoring and evaluation is both a bottom-up and a top-down agenda. We have good research that shows that sometimes top-down type of accountability mechanisms can work just as well, if not better, than bottom-up ones. If for no other reason, then it's a pretty sad message if the post-2015 goals message to poor people is, yes, we have your backs, and now you need to come to more meetings. Really what I think we need to do is when can we build the capacity of the state to do its job so that our dominant message to poor people is not that you need to spend more time coming to meetings. Wealthy people in the north don't have to come to meetings to get their water turned on. I think one of our visions for the future is that poor people in the world shouldn't have to do that either. I think one of the open challenges is what we're going to do thinking about climate finance, which is inevitably going to bring issues of conditionality back into financial transfer debate, and how we're going to think about that in terms of the accountability and effectiveness agenda. And finally, some of the new institutional reforms in Canada, Australia, and elsewhere that are about re-centralizing aid organizations within the ministries of foreign affairs is going to pose, I think, a particular political economy challenge to aid organizations. Excuse me. I'm going to quickly skim through this and simply want to, because Richard has already touched on some of this already, but that I think some of the areas where we've seen aid organizations move to mechanisms like cash on delivery aid and the exploration by some NGOs of unconditional cash transfers is a very exciting space to think about where aid can be going as we move into the post-2015 debate, and raise the broader question of how we can reduce the levels of bureaucracy within aid organizations to enable communities and governments to, in fact, develop their own innovative solutions. This is a model that Twaweza uses, which is an organization in Tanzania that tries to think about the multiple relationships, both horizontal and vertical, that are essential and constitutive of an accountable governance mechanism. And where we think about the role of funding is not just, well, that stuff that we need to keep our organization open, but domestic resource mobilization and taxes are the material basis of an accountability relationship between citizens and their government, and that a central part of aid organizations is building the capacity of local and national governments to actually build their own domestic resource mobilization capacity. Finally, in conclusion, I think I would argue that the weakest MDG was the number 8 MDG, the development partnership. Where it was clear that both on the question of aid and broader issues of policies that the North was, very happy to have a rhetorical commitment, but wasn't really willing to take on the serious choices necessary. And I think so far the debate around climate in my country in particular, the US, has been singularly bad in this. And that I think what we need to think about, again, as a political economy model, if we're going to focus on aid, is that aid organizations are ultimately not responsive to the people they claim to serve. They're ultimately responsible to the taxpayers and their elected representatives in the North. So the faster that we can move away from an ODA-dominated debate about development effectiveness to other forms of finance, they're not going to eliminate the debates around accountability and effectiveness, but I think it'll put us on a firmer footing. Thanks very much.
Thank you, John, for reminding us that accountability is a complex and sometimes conflicted partnership. And thank you also to all the speakers so far for sticking to our 10-minute time slot, which I hope the next 3 will do as well. So next on our list is Gordon Manuan from the Office of the Special Envoy on MDGs for the President of the Republic of Indonesia. I would invite him to take the floor and speak on partnerships, especially the Indonesian experience here, but also more broadly, should you wish.
Thank you. First of all, allow me to thank the Korean government and the UNDP for hosting this very important event and inviting me to be part of this important meeting. My talk will focus on the role of partnership, particularly intersectoral partnership in accelerating the MDG achievement in Indonesia. We will see how it has played an important role in very successful implementation of MDG programs at community level. Also in this presentation, we will also see how we can harness the potential of a new global partnership as envisaged by high-level panel in not only supporting MDGs, but also in supporting the post-2015 development agenda. But before we go into that, let's take a look at the current status of the MDG achievement in Indonesia. Like many countries in the world, Indonesia shows a mixed level of progress in the MDG achievement. There are some targets that have been met, particularly those related to poverty reduction, gender equality, and a portion of health-related MDG. This concerns a decreased prevalence of tuberculosis. There are also some targets that are on track to be achieved by 2015. But perhaps what is more important is that there are some other targets that are lagging behind, and they need extraordinary effort and nationwide breakthroughs in order that they can be met in 2015, or at least to get as close as possible to the set targets. Here we have targets related to maternal mortality and HIV/AIDS. Also, there are targets related to high level of greenhouse gas emission and safe drinking water and sanitation. Those targets need extraordinary efforts and breakthroughs at local and national level in order that can be met by 2015. There is no doubt that we have formidable challenges to overcome in achieving MDGs in Indonesia. And this can be attributed to a number of factors related to geographical conditions. Indonesia is a large archipelagic country with considerable geographical span and barriers. There are also problems posed by infrastructure conditions that need to be continually improved and developed. And all this pose enormous challenges to providing access to healthcare facilities, particularly community health center for poor people in underserved remote areas. Now, this is only to cite only a few problems that we have to deal with in accelerating the achievement of the MDG targets in Indonesia. We also face challenges posed by population growth. As a country with the fourth largest population in the world, we are seeing a population growth in Indonesia that seems to outpace the progress of development. We have a success story of family planning in the past, but now we are trying very hard to repeat its past successes. Now, adding to this complexity is the fact that the bulk of our population is young people at productive age. And with the increased life expectancy rate that we have now, we should be able to deal with the challenges of taking care of a sizable portion of the aging population in the future. Now, one typical challenge that we have to deal with concern women's and children's health in Indonesia. There is growing concern that the gains achieved in reducing maternal mortality rate are not enough. And more effort should be put into reducing the current rate, which now stands at 228 maternal deaths per 100,000 live birth. This is the area in which sustainable intersectoral partnership can play a vital role in reducing the high maternal mortality rates. Of course, there are problems on the ground related to infrastructure, family planning, nutrition, availability of skilled health personnel, and access to healthcare services. But we believe that these challenges can be dealt with effectively through out-of-the-box approach and a sustainable intersectoral partnership. In fact, the government of Indonesia has put the MDG achievement on the top of its agenda, and has been making every effort to accelerate the MDG achievement. There are some milestones in the effort to achieve the MDG targets, some of which have their legal framework in the Presidential Instruction of 2010, which is aimed to accelerate the MDG achievement by 2015. Chief among these are the National Roadmap to accelerate the MDG achievement. There is also a mainstreaming of the MDGs into national development plans and budget, and there is also an action plan at provincial and district levels to accelerate the MDG progress. And apart from that, there is also an annual event of Indonesia MDG Awards. This event is aimed to incentivize the MDG stakeholder across different sectors to accelerate the MDG's targets through their best practices at the community level. When it comes down to the question of who the initiator for the implementation of the MDG programs is, the approach we pursue is a two-pronged strategy which combines tops-down and bottoms approaches. Through sustainable, broad-based partnership, we feel that it's not only government that plays an active role in initiating various MDGs programs, but the community is becoming increasingly active in taking responsibility for improving their own lives. From time to time, we have seen that the community-driven programs which involve a broad-based partnership have proved to be more sustainable and serve their purposes better than a mere top-down approach. One MDG program that displays a strong intersectoral partnership is what we call in Indonesia Pencerahan Nusantara, which literally means Nation's Guiding Light. This is a community-based integrated healthcare program carried out in some remote areas in Indonesia. This program is developed and implemented by Office of Special Envoy on MDGs in partnership with the private sector, civil society, academia, and local government. This is a model program which aims to generate better health outcomes for communities at the grassroots level in underserved areas who are deprived of access to healthcare services. The distinctive feature of this program is that it integrates various aspects of human development, including education and community empowerment, with community health at the forefront. And we put a strong focus on preventive measures in this program. This is an important aspect that has not received sufficient attention among communities at the grassroots level. The underlying idea of the Nation Guiding Light program is that government's efforts alone are not enough to ensure the achievement of the MDG target. At the same time, there is growing awareness among the MDG stakeholders that other sectors, such as private sector and civil society, should be involved on a sustainable basis in this immense undertaking. Therefore, an intersectoral partnership which involves a wide range of different actors needs to be put in place. And Pencerahan Nusantara is an example of how a program can bring together different partners, ranging from private sector, civil society, academia, media to governments at local level to bring about changes for communities in underserved remote areas in Indonesia. As we are approaching the deadline of MDGs by 2015, we feel that a new global partnership, as envisaged by the high-level panels, will play a significant role in promoting and achieving the post-MDG agenda. But in order to ensure that this partnership can be effective and have far-reaching impact, we need to identify some enabling conditions for achieving the new development agenda. Most of the talk about post-2015 development framework revolve around the need to promote sustainable development. And indeed, the report of high-level panel recommends that sustainable development be put at the core in the new development plans. The report calls for an integration of economic, social, and environmental aspects of sustainable development as reflected in the Millennium Declaration. Various aspects that fall into economic, social, and environmental pillars should be seen as interlinked to each other and should be properly brought together in a well-balanced manner. However, to make sure that everything works properly, we believe that all these aspects should be underpinned by peace, security, and good governance exercised by government, private sector, and civil society. The report of high-level panel also highlights the fact that the new development agenda needs to be driven by 5 big transformative shifts, which reflect the current demands for new development goals. They cover a range of interconnected areas with more ambitious goals to put an end to extreme poverty by leaving no one behind. And to achieve all these goals, the new role of new global partnership is crucial. The new global partnership we envisage for post-2015 agenda goes beyond the traditional partnership between government. This partnership should be broadened and cut across all social classes, including poor people, people with disabilities, women, civil society, indigenous and local communities, marginalized groups, multilateral institutions, and local and national government, business community, academia, and private philanthropy. In short, we are looking at a new global partnership that goes beyond an 8 agenda. In terms of development assistance, it's expected that ODA will play a more significant role in accelerating the MDG achievement and supporting the post-MDG framework. And with a new global partnership that cuts across development actors, innovative ways of development assistance could be explored. In this context, governments could forge sustainable partnership with private sector and civil society in designing and developing appropriate development assistance for ODA recipients. Further, government could create enabling circumstances for private sector to participate in social investment through inclusive business that contribute to the MDG achievement and post-2015 agenda. In designing and implementing our MDG program, there are some partners that we traditionally work closely with in a sustainable partnership. There are private sector, civil society, youth groups, and government at both local and national level. And in this context, usually they have their unique capacities and expertise that we can harness. Youth groups usually have unique capacities in such things as mass campaign, through social media, while private sector is good at scaling up partnership. And civil society is well versed in capacity building and evaluation and reporting, while government plays advocacy role and creates enabling environment. All these different partners are brought together in inclusive, integrated, and collaborative action. The successful implementation of the MDG program at the community level in our country shows that a broad-based, sustainable partnership that generates a collective action is essential to accelerating the MDG progress. The importance of a strong intersectoral partnership cannot be overemphasized, and with new global partnership we can harness, we will be in a better position to meet the challenges of the post-2015 development agenda. Now that concludes my overview of the role of the new global partnership in accelerating the MDG achievement and supporting the post-2015 development agenda. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Gordon, and especially for that very interesting example from Indonesia. I would now like to invite our next speaker, Mr. Chen Xiaochun, who is the counselor for the People's Republic of China in the Republic of Korea. And he has had extensive experience in foreign affairs and relationships within the Department of Asian Affairs. And as such, I would invite him to speak on partnerships if possible, from the perspective of China. As we've all heard, the global partnership needs to be realigned, and one of the ways is to accommodate new actors. Hence, these remarks will be particularly meaningful. Over to you. Thank you.
여러분 안녕하십니까? 저는 주한 중국 대사관 참사 진서춘이라고 합니다. 베이징의 지시에 따라 이번 포스트 2015 개발 아젠다의 이행과 영향 서울 국제회의에 참석하게 된 데 대해서 아주 반갑게 생각합니다. 제 영어는 형편없이 서투르기 때문에 비교적 자신 있는 한국말로 스피치를 하겠습니다. 그래서 여러분의 양해와 동시통역분의 도움을 잘 부탁드리겠습니다. 우선 이번 회의를 공동으로 주최하신 한국 정부와 UNDP에 감사를 드립니다. 포스트 2015 개발 아젠다는 현재 국제개발협력 분야에서 관심의 초점이 되고 있고 제68차 유엔 총회 주제이기도 했습니다. 얼마 전 폐막한 유엔 총회 일반성 변론 기간 유엔은 MDG와 관련한 특별 회의 등 중요한 행사들을 개최하였고 각국 지도자들께서 국제 개발 협력에 관한 많은 고견들을 내놓았습니다. 이는 우리의 향후 업무 방향을 제시한 것으로서 진지하게 연구하고 이행할 가치가 있다고 봅니다. 중국은 지난달 포스트 2015 개발 아젠다에 대한 중국 측 입장에 관한 문건을 발표하여 개발 아젠다에 대한 중국 측의 견해와 입장을 전면적으로 소개하였습니다. 저는 이를 기초로 다음 몇 가지 점들을 강조하려고 합니다. 첫째, MDG 이행의 진전에 관해서 객관적으로 평가해야 된다는 것입니다. 이행 과정에서 얻은 경험과 득실을 충분히 총결산하여 이를 토대로 포스트 2015 개발 아젠다를 전망해야 합니다. 개발 아젠다는 개성도 있지만 발전도 있어야 되며 역량을 집중하여 오랫동안 해결하지 못했던 어려운 문제들을 해결하는 동시에 미래를 내다보며 새로운 도전에도 대응해야 할 것입니다. 둘째, 개발 아젠다는 빈곤 감소를 핵심으로 하고 발전을 기조로 삼아야 할 것입니다. 국제금융위기는 글로벌 빈곤 감소에 지장과 난관을 갖다 주었고 식량 및 에너지 자원의 안전과 기후 변화 등은 취약계층이 빈곤해지거나 이전의 빈곤으로 되돌아가는 위험을 더욱 가중시키고 있습니다. 국제사회는 시대와 함께 나아가며 개발을 통해 발전을 모색해야 합니다. 각국은 시장을 더 한층 개방해서 보호주의를 억제하고 개발도상국의 경제 발전에 양호한 외부 발전 환경을 조성해야 합니다. 셋째, 개발 아젠다는 양호한 체제와 구조를 기반으로 해야 합니다. 유엔은 발전 이념과 규칙 제정 면에서의 리더십과 조율의 역할을 계속 발휘해야 합니다. 유엔이 중심이 되고 기타 다자 기구가 지지하는 국제개발 구조를 더 완벽화시켜야 합니다. 국제개발기구는 빈곤 감소의 기능을 강화해야 하고 금융기구는 발전 자금의 조달을 강화해야 하며 무역기구는 무역을 촉진시키면서 지원을 하는 역할을 계속 발휘해야 할 것입니다. 개발 아젠다의 이행을 위한 다방면에서 협력하는 체제 보장이 마련되어야 한다고 생각합니다. 넷째, 개발 아젠다는 해결이 어려운 두드러진 문제들을 해결해야 합니다. 현재 정부 개발 원조가 지속적으로 감소하고 양적, 질적으로 모두 지원이 줄고 있습니다. 국제사회는 반드시 문제의 심각성과 시급성을 인식하고 정부의 개발 원조 지원 약속이 실제적으로 이행될 수 있도록 추진해야 합니다. 재정, 물자, 기술과 인력 등 각종 수단을 종합적으로 이용하여 개발도상국의 투자 환경 개선과 역량 강화에 중점적으로 도와줘야 할 것입니다. 여러분, 현재 개발도상국 간의 교역과 투자가 날로 활발히 이루어지고 있고 새로운 시스템이 계속 수립되고 새로운 제의가 계속 나오고 있습니다. 남남 협력이 한창 발전하고 있고 밝은 전망을 가지고 있습니다. 개발도상국은 이러한 추세를 잘 이용해서 서로의 장점을 취해 단점을 보완하고 협력 루트를 끊임없이 넓혀 나가야 합니다. 또 협력의 내실을 더욱 다지고 더욱 새로운 협력 패러다임을 만들어야 하며 무역, 투자, 인프라 등 각 분야에서 호혜와 협력을 강화하여 남남 협력의 새로운 도약을 이뤄야 할 것입니다. 여기서 지적해야 할 점은 개발도상국 간 호혜와 협력의 방식의 하나인 남남 협력은 서로 혜택을 주는 자발적이고 무조건적인 것으로서 남북 협력의 개발 원조 성격과는 다르다는 것입니다. 남남 협력은 단지 남북 협력에 대해 유익한 보완 역할을 할 수 있을 뿐입니다. 국제사회는 이 둘을 동일시해서는 안 되고 남남 협력이 남북 협력을 대신하도록 요구해서는 더욱 안 됩니다. 국제개발협력의 주요 루트라는 남북 협력의 지위는 흔들릴 수 없으며 그 지위는 2015년 이후에도 계속 유지될 것입니다. 여러분, 중국은 새천년 개발 목표의 적극적인 지지자입니다. 지난 13년 동안 중국은 경제 사회 발전을 전면적으로 추진하였고 국민 생활 개선에 큰 힘을 넣었습니다. 빈곤 인구가 4억 7,100만 명이나 줄어 빈곤 감소 목표를 앞당겨 달성한 첫 개발도상국이 되었습니다. MDG의 이행 상황을 점검하기 위해 중국 정부는 중국 주재 유엔 대표 기구와 협력하여 지금까지 5차례에 걸쳐 중국의 새천년 개발 목표 이행 진전 상황 보고서를 발표하였습니다. 2013년 판 보고서는 지난달에 공식 발표되었는데 오늘 회의에도 저희가 참고로 보고서를 조금 가져왔습니다. 여러분께서 각자 가져가시거나 인터넷에서 다운로드 받으실 수 있습니다. 중국은 또한 국제 개발에서 져야 할 책임에 대해 자기 해야 할 본분을 잘 하고 있습니다. 구체적인 행동으로 협력과 윈윈에 대해 설명하는 것입니다. 2000년부터 중국은 남남 협력의 틀 안에서 120여 개 개발도상국 나라들의 지원을 주었고 700여 개의 인프라 구축이나 농업, 교육, 보건 분야의 협력 프로젝트를 실시했습니다. 200여 개의 학교를 지원하고 각 분야에서 8만여 명의 인재를 육성하였으며 40여 개의 병원과 30여 개의 말라리아 예방치료센터 건설을 지원했습니다. 개발도상국을 대하고 남남 협력을 대하는 우리의 태도는 일관되고 확고합니다. 우리는 이익보다는 의리를 중시하고 우선시하며 공동 발전하는 것을 견지하고 있습니다. 우리는 자국의 발전을 여러 개발도상국들의 발전과 긴밀히 연관시켜 최대한 개발도상국들의 도움을 주고 있습니다. 중국의 발전은 전 세계에게 기회가 됩니다. 우리는 세계 각국과 발전에 대한 생각과 정책의 교류를 더 강화하며 협력과 윈윈의 자세로 포스트 2015 개발 아젠다의 제정에 동참할 것입니다. 감사합니다.
Thank you to Mr. Chen Xiaochun and for elaborating on the complementary roles of North-South and South-South assistance. Our final speaker on this panel is Ad Melkert. He was previously the UN Undersecretary General and Special Representative of the Secretary General for Iraq. Prior to that, Associate Administrator for UNDP, Board of Directors at the World Bank, and has a long and distinguished political career in the Netherlands as well. Ad was also at UNDP when I first started work there, so a particular pleasure for me to invite him to be on this panel. Over to you, Ed.
Well, thank you very much, Shantanu, and it's great to be back at UNDP, and it's even more wonderful to be here in Korea and to see the commitment of the government and so many organizations and individuals in this room and outside this room, no doubt, in having Korea play a much more assertive role in helping the development agenda to be accomplished in the years ahead. I want to say a few things about financing for development, and I'm afraid it's not on a very optimistic note that I'm going to say a few things, because it looks like the marathon runner that saw the 2015 or sees the 2015 finish is feeling very tired legs before arriving there. And indeed, that's exacerbated by what Mr. Chen rightly noted, the global crisis that seems to draw a number of the protagonists of the MDGs in the traditional donor sides quite back from their commitments. So there's reason to worry. And I think that's what one sees also in two important reports that have been published just in the recent months, the MDG Task Force reports and the UN Secretary General's report on the follow-up of the Financing for Development conference that took place a number of years ago in Monterrey in Mexico. Just very briefly, when one looks at the main components of financing for development, the report is not very positive. ODA is basically going down. Trade is increasing still with a number of developing countries, but overall the global trade pattern is certainly pointing at the wrong direction, and the implications are of course also for particularly middle-income countries negative. Remittances, what migrant workers transfer back home, are still increasing slightly, but certainly not as one would have expected, and certainly not translated into structural development at home. And obviously many migrant workers also get hit by the crisis, get unemployed, have to go back home. Is not a rosy picture there. Fiscal adjustment, also in middle income and developing countries, means that there is a downward pressure on expenditures that actually were supposed to be going up. A positive note is the completion for almost all of the countries that were heavily indebted. It has been an exercise of about 10 years to bring many countries to this point of debt cancellation, which is of course very important to make a fresh start. However, in quite a number of countries, one also sees that debts are starting to increase again, so one wonders where that will end up. Provision of essential medicines, not a lot of progress being achieved and still so much more needed, and increase of access to ITC, to the internet, certainly an increase, yet still far from what the developed world shows in terms of access. So the gap between rich and poor is hardly decreasing. And what has not been dealt with under this agenda, but what I think should also be noted, is the recently published hunger map by WFP and other UN organizations that still shows a big chunk of countries where many, many people are suffering hunger, or malnutrition. So this is not to spoil the party, but I think it is necessary to note that we're in a difficult stage at this moment. And I just wanted to show you actually just one slide, because you've seen so many slides, maybe not too many more, I'm not sure whether it's, so it's 1 through 5. I don't know why it's 1, 1, 2, 1, 1. It's 5 points. And the 5 points, I can count to 5, I tell you. The 5 points are really the 5 challenges where I would see a certain potential to make progress despite the relatively bleak picture that we're confronted with. And it's building on a number of the contributions that we've heard this morning, also some of the analysis of the high-level panel. So the first point, in my view, is really looking more closely at the taxation side. In the analysis by Mary Lou from the World Bank, there was already some indications as to what the trends are. But I still have difficulties to see why, even in a poor country, the percentage of GDP in taxation, it's a low GDP, so the absolute numbers of money is of course low, but you can still try to collect tax. It may be an issue of capacity that is available or not, but I dare say that there are other issues at hand that should be addressed urgently. It's domestic interest standing in the way. It's also ideological restraint. I'm afraid also sometimes, or more often than not, in the Bretton Woods institutions, that does not make tax collection a very central issue. And in the Secretary General's report, it is noted that less than 5% of developing countries' population pay personal income tax. And I believe that is a really shameful number, which shows the potential of doing something about it. But as all of us know from our national practice, taxation issues are always by definition sensitive, and they're probably even more sensitive in international organizations, certainly also in the UN. In my view, that taboo has to be addressed in order to make progress. That's related to the second point, putting focus on old instruments before you start to talk about new instruments. It strikes me that there's an inordinate amount of discussion on new instruments like financial transaction taxes or CO2 tax, emission taxes. And coming from Europe, I can tell you that that's a very long way to go. It's very complicated, it's very political, and you're not going to see anytime soon big results of that. However, on the other hand, going back to that example of personal income tax that is very low, or value-added tax that is in many countries hardly existing and not too difficult to implement, or corporate taxation, particularly in the area of natural resources. So the good old traditional taxation instruments, personal income tax, corporate tax, and VAT, why not first concentrate on that? And if you get that machine going, it might be necessary still to look at innovative instruments in order to collect some more money, because the demand is of course very high for finances. But I have sometimes the feeling that the order is the reverse, and I wonder whether that's the most effective way to collect finances for development. The third point is, again connected to that, transform the informal into the formal. And I mean with that, part of the problem that many developing countries are dealing with is that sometimes even a majority of the population and a majority of workers is simply not part of the formal system, is simply not paying money, is of course also not able to claim social security or pension rights or universal health coverage, all these things that have been mentioned this morning. Now, connecting the possibility to benefit from the collection of collective resources, particularly universal health coverage and the social protection floor, as was highlighted this morning, are extremely important in that regard, would require that everybody is contributing, because we know also from industrialized states' experiences, you cannot have generous systems of social support if not the maximum number of people do contribute to that. So it has always to be a balance at the two ends. And here again, the SG's report notes importantly about financial inclusiveness, that 2.5 billion adults do not have access to formal financial services. So just a very simple thing, not having an account. And I wonder whether a kind of simple campaign of making sure that everybody has an account, that everybody has a registration number and a tax number, whether that would not be, and a debit card, whether that would not be an enormous potential breakthrough of drawing people into the formal system, and then making sure, of course, that income and the benefit entitlements will be a kind of deal, basically, that will benefit all sides. This is a way forward that sometimes is a little bit too far away in the more abstract discussions that we're having with each other, and yet it is so close. I'm fascinated by what's going on in India with the registration of people. It's a unique project. Well, it's not unique, because I think in China a lot has been done on that as well, and it's part of the basis of the Chinese success, that you know where the people are and that they have a name and a number and a face, and that you can reach them. And this is still far away in many developing countries and should, in my view, be part of the financing for development agenda. Then the fourth point I'd like to mention is about ODA. For another reason than what John said, I think it could be important to relativize the ODA importance. I am myself very much in favor of a stronger ODA contribution. I think it's essential solidarity, an essential transfer of wealth and prosperity that is also a moral imperative to do. But unfortunately, I have to note that in many countries, particularly in Europe, that willingness is not so much there any longer. And it shows how difficult it will be also to keep that for the future, which means that in the financial strategies of developing countries, it would be very important to develop a strategy of reducing dependence on ODA. Because like it or not, but you know, it's not going to be there to the extent that you might like to see it or that you would have expected it. So use ODA for experimentation, for transition facilitation, maybe for emergencies, but don't count upon it in the longer run, and factor that into the longer run financial strategies. And I think it's worth having that discussion instead of complaining all the time about ODA far from reaching the 0.7 target, and now even being decreased rather than increased. And finally, the data. Many have spoken about that. I just want to add one notion, that data comparison, sometimes even, I know in the UN it's not very popular, but the naming and shaming, comparing why does country X much better than country Y, and daring to mention the reasons of success and of failure by their name. That could be of great help to focus really more the financing for development agenda. I thought also the ILO reference to affordability and fiscal space was very important. And sometimes I have in mind the standing OECD practice between the members of the OECD, where really on a regular basis there are kind of examinations, voluntary examinations, as to the policies that countries pursue as compared to a kind of guiding framework that has been agreed by the OECD membership. Now, I know that that is tricky, because certainly the North should not start to examine the South. I think there are very many reasons that the South could actually examine the North. But thinking about more committing ways of calling upon each other what we are doing and where we're heading for could be helpful. And to go back to the first point, I've always thought that one of the most successful instruments that UNDP used and still uses is the Human Development Index. I also know that that regularly can lead to delicate discussions with members, but still it has to be done. And one of the things that the Human Development Index shows is that collecting a lot of taxes, like in the Nordic countries, is actually a basis for success in terms of human development and in terms of economic and technological development. And in that sense also an example of how you can measure, and as we know, to measure is to know, and this should be a great help to the financing for development agenda in the years ahead. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ed, for those very insightful remarks, both from your professional experience as a politician in your own country and also at UNDP, where Ed was actually one of the champions of the MDG Gaps Task Force report, which has become such a benchmark for assessing MDG 8 these days. We now have 10 minutes and till the coffee break, and I'd like to invite questions from the floor. If you would raise your hand. Okay, let me set the ball rolling by asking one question to Richard here.
Some hands going up.
Oh, are there some hands going up? Oh, good. Okay. All right. So, over here. At the back. Okay, please introduce yourself, and if you're asking a specific member of the panel, please mention that too.
My name is Hamid Karim, and I'm from the government of Pakistan, but here I'm studying development studies in Angkok University of Foreign Studies. I have two small questions. First is kind of a general question. Anybody can reply to that question. As the final deadline for Millennium Development Goals is fastly approaching, which is December 2015. So is there any kind of thinking that the same development like targets or agenda will be extended for like specific period for 5 years or like more, or there will be a new post 2015 agenda and targets? So just to I want myself to clarify. And secondly, to John Greshman, that the aid effectiveness, or rather the development effectiveness, has been in the debate for so many years, and from global level to the country level, people are talking about it. So do you think that it's the high-level forum and the other events like Paris Declaration, Busan Declaration is more kind of generalized, generalized framework rather than more focused or target-oriented aid or development effectiveness framework? Do we need more focused or like target-oriented effectiveness agenda for the future? Thank you very much.
Richard, would you like to take the first one, and then John can take the second?
I think that most people would agree that there's unfinished business under the MDGs, but I don't think that would lead many people to suggest that we simply say, well, we didn't reach the target by 2015, let's try and reach it by 2020. I think it's more likely the conversation will be about, let's pick another period, maybe 15 years or something like that, and let's see where we need to get to by the end of that. And obviously, we need more searching targets. So if you take poverty, we shall have reduced poverty as proportion by 50%, which was the target. But there's now proposed by the high-level panel and others that we should get to 0 on the whatever indicator of poverty we choose by 2030. So I think a lot of the same domains will be relevant, but I think that the goal setting will be done differently. And secondly, I'd draw your attention to the fact the high-level panel, I think this is a very sound proposal, talk about goals being agreed internationally, but targets being set nationally. And this is an approach which will greatly increase local ownership if it's done that way. So it would be for each country to say, against this goal, how fast are we planning to move? So I think there'll be a rather new approach to target setting and not simply rolling forward what was done before.
And to just pick up where Richard left off, I think the high-level panel and the kind of Paris, Accra, Busan stuff is great as an agenda-setting kind of element. But to pick up on something that was mentioned earlier, you manage what you measure. And so having more narrow targets, particularly at the local and national level, that can be tools of advocacy for the range of stakeholders involved in the debates is going to be fundamentally important and much more focused. I think the bigger question, given the theme of the conference overall, is there's one debate as to what the targets and goals should be. And then the part of the effectiveness question is, how do you achieve them? And how do we use data and evidence to choose amongst and between a range of possible policy instruments? And I think that's really the heart of the implementation question, is the question of the how. And basically, do states and other stakeholders have the capacity to be able to move through a learning process of experimenting, trying particular interventions, they work, they don't work, kind of moving, and that's really the implementation challenge.
We have a question over there, and then one over here. So we'll take both. Please keep your questions brief.
Hello. Yes, good afternoon. Thank you so very much for the conference and for the exposition. My name is Cecilia Grosa. I'm from Paraguay. I'm a student from Korea University. My question is related to South-South cooperation and triangular North-South-South cooperation. That I just want to know what the panel think about considering the lower cost of South-South cooperation and also the declining ODA. What do you think about encouraging more triangular cooperation, that is North-South-South? For example, in particular, my country have a very successful case about Germany and Australia providing a fund for South-South cooperation between Chile and Paraguay. So just want to know.
We have a question over here.
Nice to meet you, gentlemen. I'm Marvin Kwon, and I'm the global energy solution provider. So I have accumulated many practical things but your concern is now you are coordinating ODA, but the ODA have their unique policy, like social foreign policy. They are not concerning about the global objective. So I want to question about you gentlemen that how do you make a financial resource? That's the important key thing, I think. And you have any plan to financial resource pooling? That's my question. Please answer me. Thank you.
All right. one final question from that corner, and then we'll throw it to the panel.
Thank you, Chairman. Please forgive me, I cannot stand up by myself because I'm using wheelchair. My name is Jae-ho Kim. I'm working for DPI Korea. I'm one of the Disability International People's Organization is a team manager. So we've been monitoring many years about the MDG strategy, but it's disability issue is not involved. So how think about the disability issue to involve on the post 2015, and then please mention about that to this kind of thing. Thank you so much.
All right, so we have three questions, one on triangular cooperation, one on financial resource pooling, and the third is involving issues around disabilities in the post-2015 agenda. Do we have any volunteers from the panel to take this? Ad, would you like to go first?
Well, let me just say something on the financial resources and on the triangular cooperation. The triangular cooperation is extremely important. In fact, also to blur the distinction between, say, a kind of classic, kind of top-down way of cooperation with lots of conditions, as Mr. Chen also outlined, between North and South. On the other hand, the South-South cooperation that started on a totally different basis. But I believe that in today's world, it would be more natural to actually merge the qualities, basically, of the two approaches and to find places in the world where both ends would meet. It doesn't make sense to really have different methods to apply, and it's maybe another reason to relativize ODA. I mean, don't misunderstand me. I do think that more resources, also in terms of transfers, are warranted from richer to poorer countries. But in terms of conditionality, in terms of true dialogue and true participative approaches, I think there's all kind of reason to go in the direction that you showed, and your example may be very interesting to look at. On financial resources, very important is to acknowledge that there's no silver bullet. There's not one way to get the necessary resources available. And the bottom line is that countries themselves, even the poorest countries of today, should aim at and, as necessary, assisted in developing their own relatively autonomous development in generating resources. And one of the key issues there is investing into a more productive economy with more people participating in that economy. And allow me to come back on that when in the next session we'll try to summarize what we heard this afternoon and link that also with the recommendations of the high-level panel.
Mr. Chen, would you like to say something? We could just go down this panel in this direction. Would you like to say something on these questions?
많이 말씀드릴 거 없는데 그냥 저희 왕이 외교부장님이 지난 유엔 총회 때 중국 측의 입장을 말씀하신 내용에 대해서 여기서 한번 설명을 해드리겠습니다. 왕이 장관님은 그 회의에서 중국은 아직은 부유하지 않지만 친구를 도와주고 싶다. 그리고 우리는 자기의 제도와 발전 모델을 수출을 할 용의가 없지만 개도국 나라들이 더 많은 한 가지의 뭐 선택이라도 참고로 되도록 이렇게 해드리고 싶다. 그러면서 우리가 자기의 일을 착실하게 하면서 그 동시에 우리 친구들에게 힘 닿는 대로 이 도움을 이렇게 제공해 드리고 싶다. 이런 말씀하셨습니다. 제가 모두의 스피치 때도 말씀드린 것처럼 저희 중국은 남남 협력 그 차원에서 개도국 나라들 또 극빈국 이런 친구 나라들에 대해서 많은 지원을 해오고 있고 앞으로도 계속 할 것입니다. 저희 중국 측의 발표 보고서에 그 통계 숫자가 하나 있습니다. 지난 2000년부터 2012년 사이에 중국 측은 개도국에 대한 그 대외 원조 총액은 인민폐로 2,500여억 원이 되었습니다. 그 지금 달러로 환산되면은 308.5억 불입니다. 물론 중국은 아직도 개도국이지만 그래도 자기 힘 있는 대로 이런 개도국들에 대한 지원을 하고 있고 개도국의 빈곤 감소 또 자주적 이런 발전을 지원하기 위해서 힘을 계속 기울이고 있습니다. 앞으로도 양자 채널과 그다음에 다자적 이런 국제의 이런 무대를 이용해서 개도국 발전에 중국의 지원에 중국이 계속 참여를 할 것입니다.
Gordon, any quick thoughts on that? We're answering questions on triangular cooperation, financial resource pooling, and involving issues around people with disabilities. Right. John, no? It's okay. John? No? Okay. Richard.
Very briefly, I think triangular cooperation has much to be said for it from many points of view, and particularly cooperation where perhaps the northern donor is providing finance, the intermediate level donor is providing the institutional support. Because if you take these big areas like how to improve taxation, how to improve national statistics and so on, many OECD countries simply don't have relevant capacity to do that. The capacity is strained anyway, and the capacity is probably less relevant. If you take countries like India, China, Brazil, South Africa, and so on, they have big assets in relation to, say, national statistics, taxation, other forms of things that are really central to government. Their expertise is usually more relevant to poorer countries. And I think there's huge scope for doing this, so long as it's very clearly demand-led and not supply-driven. I think it's very useful. On resource pooling, I think there's great scope for resource pooling in support of energy in particular, because energy is in many ways a financially viable sector if it's properly managed. And that's where there's a huge role for intelligent use of the assets of international financial institutions and others to bring together ODA on the one hand and private sector finance on the other to enable resources to be pooled effectively to promote these activities. Of course, there are many other investments that need to be made where it's not possible because there's not a revenue stream, but where you've got a strong revenue stream, there's great scope for doing this. And finally, on disabilities, I think this is a really important point. I think that the world has paid too little attention to this issue, and I would be rather hopeful that as we look forward to what would be reasonable areas for focused concentration in the health sector, it's not just health, it's social and everything, that I think disability does deserve to come much higher up the agenda along with a number of other issues, and I would be very much encouraging those thinking about the setting of goals and targets for the medium term to think much more seriously about disability than they have done in the past.
Well, first of all, thanks to everyone on the panel for sharing their insights and perspectives in such complementary fashions. And although we'd organized this discussion around 4 themes, capacity and institutions, new forms of accountability and monitoring, partnerships and resources for development, I think it's abundantly clear to everybody that these are mutually supporting, synergistic, and there's scope for doing a lot more by building all of these together. We now are going to close this session. Thank you, everybody, for being such an engaged and participative audience. And I'm going to hand over to Rajesh for some remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, panelists. Ladies and gentlemen, I would just like to invite you to have a break, actually. Refreshments in the foyer where you were before. We will reconvene at 4 o'clock for the last session, which will have some closing remarks and a chance to reflect on what we've heard during the day. So refreshments in the room over there. Thank you.